So what we're witnessing right now is a strategic masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Iran's objective isn't to defeat the United States military in a conventional sense, that the United States has no choice but to withdraw. And in the process of creating this regional chaos, Iran is actually unifying its own population around a common cause. And from a game theory perspective, this creates a massive problem for the United States. You can't win by targeting leadership because leadership is distributed. You can't predict their next move because decision-making is decentralized. And you can't negotiate with a single authority because authority is dispersed. On the surface, what's happening in Bahrain looks like an internal uprising. The timing and orchestration suggests something much more sophisticated. What we're seeing is that Israel has been working to destabilize Bahrain specifically to force Saudi Arabia into a conflict that distracts them from the larger war with Iran. Israel has been using covert operations to amplify tensions in Bahrain. They're providing intelligence to opposition groups. They're helping organize protests. They're creating the conditions for regime change. Now, why would Israel do this? Because Saudi Arabia has a defense pact with Bahrain. The two countries are deeply interconnected. The Saudi military has bases in Bahrain. They can't let a Shia uprising succeed in Bahrain because it would set a precedent and embolden Shia populations across the Gulf. So Saudi Arabia is forced to send troops into Bahrain to suppress the uprising. They have to divert military resources, intelligence assets, political attention, all to deal with this crisis in Bahrain. And while they're focused on Bahrain, they're not focused on Iran. That's the trap. The moment Saudi Arabia commits forces to Bahrain, Iran has justification to escalate. The moment Saudi forces cross into Bahrain in significant numbers, Iranian missiles start hitting Saudi oil facilities. And I'm not talking about minor disruptions. I'm talking about the systematic destruction of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity. Saudi Arabia has concentrated its oil infrastructure in the eastern province. Places like Abqaiq, Khurais, Ghawar Field. These facilities are massive and they're vulnerable. We already saw in 2019 when Houthi drones, which are Iranian-made, struck Abqaiq. That single attack took out half of Saudi oil production temporarily. That was a warning shot. But in a full-scale war scenario, Iran wouldn't just damage these facilities, they would destroy them. This would be the worst military defeat for the United States since Vietnam. Possibly worse than Vietnam in terms of the scale and speed of the collapse. Now, politically, this creates a massive problem for Trump. How do you explain to the American people that you started a war that resulted in this level of military losses? How do you maintain credibility as a strong leader when your military is being defeated? The answer is deflection and blame shifting. Trump would blame Arab leaders. He'd say, we went to war to protect Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Gulf states. We sacrificed our blood and treasure for them. And they didn't fight. They didn't support us adequately. They let us down. This defeat is their fault, not ours. This narrative serves multiple purposes. It deflects responsibility from Trump personally. It provides a scapegoat for American losses. And it prepares the ground for withdrawal by saying, we're not abandoning the region abandoned us, right? So this is the endgame scenario that I think becomes increasingly likely as the conventional war drags on. Iran has always maintained that they're not seeking nuclear weapons, that their nuclear program is purely for peaceful purposes. But the strategic reality is that the only guarantee of regime survival in the face of American hostility is nuclear deterrence. Look at the examples. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and the United States hasn't invaded. Libya gave up its nuclear program, and Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees, and then Russia invaded. The lesson is clear. If you want regime security, you need nuclear weapons. So I'm predicting that at a certain point in this conflict, probably after the US military suffers significant losses and after the GCC starts collapsing, Iran will make a strategic decision to accelerate their nuclear weapons program. And they won't do it alone. They'll get direct assistance from Russia and North Korea. Russia has every incentive to help Iran get nuclear weapons quickly. A nuclear Iran permanently complicates U.S. strategic planning. It makes regime change impossible. It creates another nuclear power that's aligned with Russia against Western interests. So Russia would provide technical assistance, maybe even materials and components that would speed up the process. North Korea has similar incentives. They want to demonstrate that their nuclear technology is exportable, that they can assist allies, and they want to create more nuclear powers to dilute American focus and resources. If America is worried about Iranian nukes in addition to North Korean nukes, that's less pressure on North Korea. So what I'm envisioning is Russian and North Korean nuclear engineers being flown into Iran. They would work at Iranian nuclear facilities, probably underground facilities that are hardened against airstrikes, and they would help Iran produce enough weapons-grade material for several nuclear devices within a matter of months rather than years. This is the nightmare scenario for the United States and Israel. Because once Iran has nuclear weapons, the entire strategic calculation changes. You can't do regime change anymore. You can't invade. You can't even threaten invasion credibly. Iran becomes essentially untouchable. More than that, they would test them live on national television. This would be an absolutely unprecedented move in nuclear history. Every other nuclear power has conducted tests somewhat secretly, or at least not as live broadcast spectacles. But Iran would do it differently. Here's the strategic logic. Iran's biggest domestic challenge has always been national unity. You have Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Balochis, different ethnic groups. You have religious diversity. You have generational divides. The Iranian government's legitimacy has always been somewhat contested, especially after the 2009 Green Movement protests. But a live nuclear test would create a massive unifying moment. It would be framed as Iran standing up to the great Satan. It would be presented as Iran joining the nuclear powers club, achieving parity with the United States, Israel, Russia. It would be a moment of intense national pride. So I'm envisioning a scenario where Iranian state television broadcasts live from somewhere in eastern Iran, probably the desert areas near the Afghan border. They've built a test site there. And they announce to the world, we are now a nuclear power. We will conduct a test at such and such time. The world is invited to watch, and then they detonate a device, live on TV, with cameras from multiple angles, maybe even allowing international journalists to film from a safe distance. The message is, this is not a bluff. This is real. We have nuclear weapons, and we're not afraid to demonstrate it. The domestic impact would be enormous. Iranians watching this would feel pride, fear, excitement, patriotism all at once. It would create a rally around the flag moment that would unify the population behind the regime more effectively than any propaganda campaign ever could. Internationally, this triggers World War III rhetoric immediately. The United States, Israel, European powers, they all start talking about WW3. The UN Security Council holds emergency meetings. There's talk of global nuclear disarmament. It becomes the dominant story globally. But here's the thing. Once Iran has demonstrated nuclear capability publicly, there's nothing anyone can do about it militarily. You can't uninvent their nuclear program. You can't bomb it away at that point. The materials and knowledge are too distributed. You have to negotiate with a nuclear Iran. That's the new reality. So this is what I see as the United States' final desperate attempt at regime change, after all other strategies have failed. The conventional military campaign hasn't worked. The economic pressure hasn't worked. Internal opposition hasn't overthrown the regime. So the CIA goes back to an old playbook. Arm a minority group and try to create a breakaway region. The Kurds are the obvious choice. There are somewhere between 8 to 10 million Kurds in Iran, concentrated in the western and northwestern parts of the country. They have a history of seeking autonomy or independence. They have armed groups that have been fighting the Iranian government on and off for decades. And crucially, they have ethnic and political connections to Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan, which creates potential for external support. So what I'm predicting is that the CIA begins covertly transferring the remaining U.S. military assets in the region to Kurdish groups in Iran. These would be weapons, ammunition, intelligence equipment, communications gear, basically everything the U.S. can't evacuate from its collapsing bases in Iraq and Syria. The CIA would work with Kurdish militant groups like PJAK, that's the Party for Free Life in Kurdistan. They would provide training, intelligence, strategic guidance. The goal would be to create a Kurdish uprising in western Iran that could potentially break off and form an autonomous region or even an independent state. And crucially, there would be American boots on the ground. Not regular military, those couldn't be deployed without congressional approval, that wouldn't come. But special forces operating covertly, CIA paramilitaries, private military contractors, probably a few thousand personnel total, working under the cover of advising Kurdish forces, but actually participating in combat operations. The strategic vision here is to create a Kurdish autonomous region in western Iran that would be pro-American. This region would control some of Iran's oil resources in the western provinces. It would create a permanent hostile entity on Iran's borders. It would demonstrate that regime change is possible, just not for the whole country, only for parts of it. But here's why I think this strategy will ultimately fail as well. Iran has dealt with Kurdish insurgencies for decades. They know how to suppress them. They have elite IRGC units specifically trained for counterinsurgency in mountainous terrain. And most importantly, a Kurdish uprising would actually help unify the rest of Iran. You see, Persian nationalism is still the dominant force in Iranian identity. If Kurds start breaking away with American help, that triggers Persian nationalist sentiment. We're not going to let Americans tear our country apart. Even Iranians who oppose the current regime would rally behind defending Iran's territorial integrity. So the Kurdish strategy becomes another trap. It costs the United States money, resources, and lives. It probably results in some Kurdish militants being killed when Iran cracks down. But it doesn't achieve regime change. It just creates more chaos, more violence, more justification for Iranian hardline policies. So let me tie all these threads together because this is really the genius of Iran's strategy, even if it's a dark genius. What we're witnessing is Iran deliberately creating chaos across multiple countries simultaneously. Bahrain is in regime crisis. Saudi Arabia's oil fields are destroyed. Their economy is collapsing. UAE's reputation as a safe haven is shattered by the Burj Khalifa strike. U.S. military bases across the region are destroyed. The petrodollar system is breaking down. Energy prices are causing economic crisis in Europe and inflation crisis in America. There's potential civil unrest in the United States and talk of World War III globally. All of this is fragmenting. The Middle East is breaking into pieces. The aligned structures that held the region together, the U.S. security umbrella, the GCC cooperation, the anti-Iran coalition, all of these are failing under the pressure. But while the region fragments, Iran unifies. Every external attack, every missile strike, every threat, it all serves to rally the Iranian population behind their government. The nuclear test becomes this massive moment of national pride. Even Iranians who don't like their government start to think, well, at least we're standing up to America. At least we're not puppets like the Gulf states. The economic hardship in Iran, and there is significant hardship, gets reframed as the price of independence. Yes, we're suffering, but we're suffering with dignity. We're not on our knees begging America for protection like the Saudis. The Kurdish insurgency, rather than fracturing Iran, actually strengthens Persian nationalist identity. We must defend our homeland against foreign-backed separatists. So, Iran emerges from this conflict more unified, more cohesive, more confident than before. They've survived the worst the United States and Israel could throw at them. They've achieved nuclear status. They've demonstrated they can project power across the region. They've shown they can bring the American military to its knees economically, if not militarily. Meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East is in ruins. The GCC states are economically devastated. Iraq and Syria are further destabilized. U.S. influence in the region is shattered. The whole post-World War II order in the Middle East, the one built on American hegemony in oil, dollar, recycling, and security guarantees, that order is over. And Iran didn't have to win conventionally to achieve this. They just had to make the cost of defeating them higher than anyone was willing to pay. They had to make the Middle East ungovernable under U.S. leadership. They had to create so much chaos that the only rational response was withdrawal. This is asymmetric warfare taken to its logical conclusion. You don't defeat the stronger power militarily. You make victory impossible to define and too expensive to achieve. You turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. You use their precision weapons against expensive targets to drain their resources. You use their alliances against them by creating situations where allies become liabilities. And in the end, Iran stands unified while the region around them burns. They've broken the Middle East to unite themselves. That's the strategy. And based on everything I'm seeing, it's working.